So, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 34. And let me just say up front, it's not an easy chapter. If you are someone who thinks that certain themes should not be um, conveyed too young, then perhaps now would be a time for you to take into consideration some alternatives that you can have for any little ones. Uh, the reality is that Genesis, as well as the rest of the Bible, does not hide certain historical situations that have occurred. And so we're going to read through Genesis chapter 34, and then we're going to go through its implications, understanding what it would have meant then and what hopefully it can mean for us now. So let's get into it. Genesis chapter 34, verse 1. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the region. When Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the region, saw her, he seized her and lay with her by force. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl. He spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl to be my wife." Now Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with his cattle in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him, just as the sons of Jacob came in from the field. When they heard of it, the men were indignant and very angry, because he had committed an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not to be done. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The heart of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourself. You shall live with us, and the land shall be open to you. Live and trade in it, and get property in it." Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "Let me find favor with you, and whatever you say to me, I will give. Put the marriage present and the gift as high as you like, and I will give whatever you ask me. Only give me the girl to be my wife." The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and the father Hamor deceitfully, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, "We cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we consent to you, that you will become as we are, and every male among you be circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters for ourselves, and we will live among you and become one people. But if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and be gone." The words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem. And the young man did not delay to do the thing, but because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. Now he was the most honored of all his family. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of their city and spoke to the men of their city, saying, "These people are friendly with us. Let them live in the land and trade in it, for the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters in marriage, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will they agree to live among us, to become one people, that every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock, their property, and all their animals be ours? Let us agree with them, and they will live among us." And all went out of the city gate, heeded Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of the city. On the third day, when they were still in pain, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took the swords and came out against the city unaware and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. And the other sons of Jacob came upon the slain, plundered the city, because their sister had been defiled. They took their flocks, their herds, their donkey, and whatever was in the city and in the field, all their wealth, and all their little ones and their wives. All that was in the houses they captured and made their prey. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me, and by making me odious in the inhabitants of the land. The Canaanites and the Perizzites, my numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." But they said, "Should our sister be treated like a prostitute?" This is a tough passage in that it conveys many adult level themes. It's also interesting to note that in this chapter, though it was mentioned in the previous chapter, and though we will see in the following chapter, God is not being mentioned in Genesis chapter 34. And I think this is also a chapter that perhaps because of that connotation, it doesn't show much grace. There's in fact obvious signs of a lack of grace that are being shown throughout this passage. One thing that we need to be aware of is that there are many things that happen in the Bible that are recorded, but they're not reflective of what God actually calls us to do. This means that not all stories in the Bible are meant to be imitated by us, but rather and more tragically, the truth is that these stories imitate us. It's the other way around. That these stories show us who we are. And the biblical writers don't try to sugarcoat the reality of human nature. They don't ignore it. And in one way, this also shows us the trustworthiness of the Bible, because if there were some giant conspiracy behind it all, compiling the Bible, these are the kinds of things that you would leave out. The fact that the biblical writers were so genuine in including these really ugly stories shows us their authenticity. It shows us their honesty in revealing our low points in human history. And in the grand scheme of things, when that becomes the background, it makes the cross of Christ all the more significant and the grace that he shows to us. So I debated for quite some time whether or not to skip this chapter because of some of the really difficult themes that are there in it. But because it shows us the raw humanity of nature, of ourselves, I thought it was important that we perhaps not skip it. There are going to be some chapters that we have skipped and that we will skip. For example, like chapter 38, we're not going to go over. Though even in chapter 38, there are important themes there that carry over into the entire history of Israel. Themes like how the unwillingness of the people of God to do the right things is contrasted by our willingness to do the wrong things, and how this reality creates a mess of things. So it's important for us to pay attention to the different elements of this story, but also I want to be sensitive to all the different listeners that are present. So there are some things that have happened in this passage, and we'll just very quickly cover it. There are certain actions that Shechem, son of Hamor, did to Dinah that are noted, and there is no minimizing the reality and the despicable nature of that action. The biblical writers go on to talk about how Shechem seems to have a turning of heart, in that in several cases, in several times, and in several ways, the biblical writers talk about how Shechem now loves Dinah and is trying to do something to make amends. Another note that we have in this chapter is the silence of Jacob, the very passive nature that he has throughout this chapter. We are able to see the radical action of Jacob's sons, and perhaps those actions are caused by the inaction of Jacob. Then you see these subtle references of being one family, which for us, as we've been reading through Genesis, we know that they are all one family, and that through Abraham, they're meant to be reunited. And we know how sometimes when this one family comes together with a wrong motivation, that things fall apart, like at the Tower of Babel. We get echoes of that reverberating in this chapter. And it seems that everyone in this chapter has mixed motivations, so that no one in this chapter can be fully condemned or fully exonerated. Everyone has their faults, and it seems like they're trying to do the right thing in certain ways. And so I think it highlights the complexity of human nature. It's quite easy for us to villainize those who are outside of us and to romanticize how good we are. But the reality is that in all people, you will find a mix of these characteristics. So the story that we find here seems to catch us off guard. And it's not that the biblical writers just happened to remember a random story and they shoved it in. This story is intentionally placed at this point in the storyline because it sets up the following chapters. It's going to set the stage for why there is this division between Jacob and his sons, or Joseph and the rest of the brothers. The reality of how Jacob treats them in this story percolates down through the rest of the chapters. And also we're able to see, again, the raw, unfiltered nature of people. And it helps us to be really genuinely shocked when we get to the culmination of Joseph's story and when we see his response towards the cruelty that his brothers had committed towards him. So let's unpack this chapter by following the motivations of the different characters. Jacob. Jacob was someone who loved Rachel, and that's what he was originally after. If you go way back to Genesis chapter 29, his eyes were set on Rachel. But then he got stuck with Leah. And he definitely did not love Leah the same way that he loved Rachel. And Leah knew this. She experienced this. And it seems very evident that the children of Leah also were aware of this lack of love that their father had for their mother and for them. If you just go back and look at Genesis chapter 29 towards the end of the chapter, you can be reminded of why Leah names her children the way that she does. Reuben was the firstborn, the eldest. Reuben was named Reuben because she said that God has seen my affliction. Surely my husband will love me now. Simeon was named that way because God heard that I am hated, she said. Levi was named that now, and I put in brackets, hopefully, now my husband will be joined to me. Time and time again, you see the wrestling and the implications of what the lack of a father's love causes in a family's life. And it's not just the father. You could say, very rightfully so, the mother. The point is this: the love of a father or the love of the mother, and perhaps even more importantly, the lack of the love that the father shows or the lack of the love that a mother shows so impacts our children and the following generations that come. After the humiliation that Dinah faces, Jacob is silent. He doesn't say anything. I can't imagine how much more humiliated it would have been for her to experience her father's silence at this point. That's another kind of level of pain that no daughter should ever have to experience. Later on, we'll see that Jacob's not an emotionless character. He goes on and on and on mourning, and he says, I will mourn until my death, when he hears about Joseph's alleged death. So he is someone who does know how to mourn. He is someone who is affected when he cares. And so this clearly sets up now what's going to be the tension between the rest of Jacob's sons. And it stems from his lack of love that he has towards his children. See, we ought to thank God for the fact that God does not treat us like this. God does not show partiality to his children. He loves all of them. And though none of us are all put together, none of us are perfect, yet he still shows concern and care for each one of us. And it becomes very problematic when we as parents, or when we as a family, or when we as a church show favoritism in this world. And when we ignore those that God has placed right in front of us. It's a deep detrimental effect that is had when the church is silent, when it ought to speak up against what has been done that is wrong. James chapter 2, verse 8 through 10 goes like this. You do well if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. It's quite easy for us to love those people who we want to love, those people who we like. It's another thing to learn to love all people. The actions that Jacob did not take were further revealed to us. At least the motivations behind them are further revealed to us in verse 30, when we see that he was just thinking about himself and the implications of how this might affect him in the long run. And I think this is often the case for so many of us still. We count our own convenience above someone else's dignity. Look at Jesus. Jesus washed even Judas's feet. See, understanding grace that Christ shows to us, it goes a long way in empowering us to be able to stand up for the rights of others. Now, looking at Shechem, though nothing can minimize the actions of what he has done, the biblical writer is clear to point out repeatedly that Shechem now at this point loves Dinah and wants to make things right. In those days, when an action like this happens before marriage, the just thing to do, the right thing to do to make amends, would be to pay whatever price the family, the victim's family says, and to then take that person as your wife, to bring her into the family and to take care of her, because otherwise she is left without a future. She has been humiliated and violated, and there's no one who will then take her in. And so the unspoken rule, the law of the land at the time, was to admit your guilt and to bring her into your family and to make amends by offering whatever was required. Though this sounds very strange and unsettling, and this would not go in today's culture, we have to pause our own tendency to impose our culture into the culture of the biblical times. And just for a moment, see the world through their eyes. We're not defending their cultural norms, but we're trying to understand the story through that situation. Because Shechem belonged to the larger tribe here. Shechem's family was stronger. He could have easily escaped any guilt, and he could have walked away from any of this. He was a prince. He was the most honorable. Who would believe the testimony of a Hebrew woman over his? Yet his love compels him to make things right. His love for her meant that he would go to his father and ask for her hand. Now, for a moment, contrast his love for Dinah with Jacob's attitude towards Dinah. And you see a very sad portrayal and contrast that's being made here. It's interesting. It's interesting to note that the whole town would be willing to follow Shechem in this action of being circumcised, which is the act of taking on the sign of the covenant, by the way. So yes, in verse 23, when we look at it, there's a hint that the rest of the community might be looking forward to the benefits that can be received when these two communities join together. Won't their livestock and their property and their animals be ours? Though we can see hints of that, it seems to be, though, that there is a genuine sense of we would benefit together if we are one. And again, remember that theme of the idea that God is trying to call all the families of the earth to be one. Perhaps this was a direction towards that. But of course, we know that that's not going to happen. If you look at it from a different perspective, there's no doubt that many people would turn to Christ if they knew the blessings that were available to them through a life of serving Christ. This is not prosperity gospel that I'm talking about here. This is the blessings of being forgiven, of having your debt removed, of having your guilt wiped away. This is what would happen when they went into agreement with Jacob and his family, that the wrong actions would not be ignored, but that they would somehow be atoned for. People of this world, I think everyone would love to have that experience of grace and the blessings, the abundance that comes with that experience. But Simeon and Levi don't let that happen. They do the opposite of what the covenant, the sign of the covenant was meant to do. And instead of joining families together, they used it as a weapon to then destroy them. Simon and Levi were Dinah's direct brothers. They were all the children of Leah. Reuben was the eldest, and Judah was the youngest, but Simeon and Levi were the two middle brothers. They could not stand what has happened to their sister. They couldn't stand the fact that their father would be silent about it. And when the father goes on ranting about how this whole situation has made him look bad and has now the implications of making his life more difficult, their only response back was, what do you expect us to do? Do you expect us to be okay when people treat our sister like this? In their mind, they seem to be motivated by a just cause. But nonetheless, it pours out of their heart as vengeance. They would go on to kill all the men of that place, and then their siblings would come in right behind them and plunder the children, the women, and all the property. In those days, it wasn't codified, but the idea of proportional judgment was the accepted practice and norm. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The terms of the arrangement should have been enough, but they wanted revenge. And I don't think that any of us are as cruel as they were, but the notion of revenge is still a reality in any one of our hearts. It's something that runs deep in our own nature, a nature of sin. Sin lavishes punishment on those around. But this story and stories like this will help us to see ourselves more clearly. And then when we paint it in contrast to the story of Jesus and how grace is lavishly poured out on us, it makes the cross so much more significant and so much more meaningful. See, God goes to the other extreme. He doesn't want to just simply make amends. He bears the weight of our own sins, and he restores us in love, not in retribution. It's quite ironic that Levi, of all people, would end up going on to represent the priesthood. Levi, the same one who used the sign of circumcision to destroy people would end up being a representation of the future church, which is called to give the sign of the covenant, of the new covenant, baptism, towards people, not to destroy them, but to bring them truly into one family, the way that God wanted and intended them to be. They used their piety to exact their payback. And that's the opposite of what Christ calls us to do. But this is the sad reality that we have to be aware of. In Jesus's time, he criticizes the religious leaders for burdening the people with laws and rules that were just too much for them. They were supposed to be lightening their load, but instead they were destroying them. We don't have to talk about too many examples because there are so many throughout the history of Christianity. But just look at the very recent and perhaps even modern examples of what the church is doing in America. Think of the time of the church during the period of slavery in America, or the period of segregation. What silence they screamed while people were getting hung. The complicit nature and the attitude that they had when so much injustice was going on around them, and how they seemed to still be preaching the gospel to people and trying to get them to be in their place. Think of the church in Germany that was silent during the rise of the Nazis. Bishop Desmond Tutu said that when the missionaries came to Africa, we had the land and they had the Bible. They asked us to pray. And when we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible. Even in our own understanding of the history of Christianity in India, we know that not all acts of the church were wholesome in India. And because of that, there's so many communities in India that are put off from hearing about Christ because of this Levi and Simeon style of reconciliation that the people of God enacted in the days. The actions of Simeon and Levi, they seem very extreme in this passage, and I know that. But we would be ignorant if we didn't see that we still do these kinds of things today. Jacob on his deathbed would call them out for it. And in Genesis chapter 49, and you can go and read how Jacob speaks to each one of his children, he harshly condemns Simeon and Levi. We're left with a lot of puzzling questions. Not too many answers are given in this chapter because the answers are given elsewhere in the Bible that we know of. But those answers are only going to make more sense for us if we seriously contemplate these questions. What are our motivations? What is driving us to do the things that we think are right? What are the things that we perpetuate that are wrong? Where are the places that we are silent when we ought to speak up? Where are the places that we are refraining from showing and expressing love and instead have a witness of partiality? These are all questions that each one of us have to wrestle within our personal lives, within our family lives, and within our church and community at large. Know that in the midst of all of this madness, and it is madness, it's almost madness to the level of it just being pure entertainment because it's unbelievable. And it continues further. Though Reuben and his discretions aren't mentioned here, they're coming up in the next chapter and the things that he's done. Judah, though we've not mentioned his things here, they're coming up too. And in all of these things, we might start to feel that it is hopeless, but God is working nonetheless. And as we will see in the chapters to follow, he is raising up a person. And specifically in Genesis, it's going to be the storyline of Joseph that we're going to be following next. God has sent us his son, and he has not left us without hope. And though we are imperfect and though we're still working on things, he assures us that his sovereignty is sure. and it is greater than even our own messy failures. So may the good Lord strengthen us to trust in him, to rely on him, to make amends, and to make repentance before the throne of grace. Amen.